Hello. Thank you all for sticking around after 4 amazing days. The stage is a little intimidating. I'm hoping for like fireworks or something, or like I could shoot out from the floor. I really like this conference. I think it's really exciting. It's a real privilege to be able to come from all over the world and share ideas with one another and debate and build communities, and I think that's really important. And I feel really privileged to be able to come here with all of you. So it also lets me try out some new ideas, and I think the title of the talk alone may give you the impression that perhaps we will leave here, hopefully, with some difficult things to think about and big conversations to have with one another. But I think these uncomfortable conversations allow us to respectfully challenge one another, and that's when I think we can start making some real growth. So I want to start by giving everyone a bit of a disclaimer. Without hearing the rest of my talk, that may seem kind of odd, but I just want to put a couple things out there. The first one is that I am vegan. I think it's an important piece of a compassionate lifestyle and a step forwards towards a more just future. And I'm not encouraging anyone to not be vegan, not to talk about it, not to be proud of being vegan. I do vegan outreach. I have been doing vegan outreach for about 20 years, and I encourage other people to do that as well. Secondly, I'm not suggesting that we align ourselves with people who are so radically different from ourselves, like fascists or skinheads or racists or anything like that. I know there was big conversations last year about people suggesting that we should maybe partner with people like fascists or people that have ties to fascism because they also care about animals. I reject all that, and I think it's an awful idea. But what I am suggesting in my talk is that we align ourselves with people who in some form or another are interested in the idea of collective liberation. But they still might not initially fall onto our radar as animal rights activists as potential allies. And we can talk a little bit more about that as we go on. So finally, I'm not a historian, nor am I trying to speak on behalf of anyone or speak on behalf of another community. So some of the historical things that I speak about have come from either reading about them or actually speaking to the people or listening to the people directly. Also, the final piece is that there is a lot of history about U.S. radicalism in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s. And I understand, obviously, that I'm in Europe, and a lot of these things may be new to you. And so I'll try to do my best to explain it. But if you have any questions, maybe we can talk about them at the end. Or if there's an immediate need for something that I'm saying that you don't understand, just raise your hand. And if I can see you through the lights, I will call on you. So when I originally did this talk, I did it once before. I didn't really think anyone was going to come. I'm actually really impressed that all of you stuck around to the very end. Very good. I'm very happy. I actually had changed the name of the title of the talk to try to sucker more people into coming. So it's called Purity Politics: How Animal Liberation is Keeping Us from Animal Liberation. And the original title actually was going to be How the Lack Bug is Destroying the Animal Rights Movement, but I didn't think anyone would actually come. So do people know what a lack bug is? Anyone? Yes. So let me try to explain, because I am not an expert in the lack bug, but I've done a little reading. So a lack bug is a tiny parasitic bug that primarily lives in South and Southeast Asia. And every year they swarm onto these trees, and they start sucking the sap out of the trees and just gorging themselves, literally, until they die. And it's called the Feast of Death. But before they die, they secrete this sap all over the tree branches, where the females lay thousands of eggs. And the eggs become fertilized. The secretions becomes hardened and encrusted to protect the eggs until they reach maturity. They hatch, and the baby lack bugs fly off to start the process all over again, which sounds great, right? They basically are like eating and fucking until they literally can't do it anymore, and then they die. My point of all this, and I'm getting to it in a minute, after all that happens, farmers come, they cut the branches, they scrape that secretion off, they heat it up, and it becomes shellac, right? Are people familiar with shellac? You often put it on furniture to make it shiny. They also make, in the United States, they call it confectionary's glaze, which is used to make candy like shiny, like Skittles or M&Ms or Junior Mints. I'm not big into European candy culture. I don't know if people have Junior Mints in Europe, but in the United States, these are like loved candies. But they weren't vegan. because they had gelatin in them. So last year, Junior Mints removed gelatin from the Junior Mints, and everyone was excited, right? Like another vegan victory under our belt, right? So let's eat all the Junior Mints we possibly can. But people were quick to point out that they still contain confectionary's glaze, which made them shiny. And by the definition of a vegan lifestyle, Junior Mints were still not vegan, which fair enough. I think you could argue on either side of the situation, but to each their own. But this turned into, as everything does, a heated debate on social media, on Facebook. Friendly conversations over Junior Mints, right, turned into all-out war with like name-calling, and you're not a real animal rights activist, and so forth and so on. And we've all, unfortunately, either been in these conversations or read these conversations, whether it's about Junior Mints or palm oil or what certain restaurants you should or should not eat at. But what all these conversations come down to is trying to point out and prove that I'm better than you, right? That I'm a better vegan than you, that I'm a better animal rights activist than you, that I care more, I work harder, and your decision to eat the excretion of a lac bug is what's holding us back from animal liberation. So what is animal liberation, right? Because when I say, what do we want? Most of you would probably respond with, yeah, right? And when do we want it? Of course we do, right? But what does that actually mean? So we're here at the International Animal Rights Conference in Luxembourg, where you can literally walk into an old slaughterhouse and buy vegan candy, an ALF support shirt, and take a virtual reality tour as the life of a pig. You see the flyers for campaigns, for about veganism, the books and the magazines, all about animal liberation. It's all in a slaughterhouse, and it feels like, this is kind of what it is. Like, this is what it feels like. So, like, when I think of animal liberation, closed slaughterhouses replaced with vegan candy sounds perfect. So when I respond to your chant, animal liberation, this is what I think it could look like. But the reality is that animal exploitation is embedded into every fabric of our lives, of our societies, of our world. Almost everything you and I eat, wear, and do, even as a vegan, comes from the exploited back of animals, whether that's human or non-human animals. So when we as a movement proclaim that we want animal liberation, and we want it now, it actually makes me think about my time in prison. So for those of you who may not be familiar with the SHAC 7 or SHAC USA, myself and 5 other individuals in our organization, SHAC USA, we were trying to shut down a laboratory called Huntington Life Sciences, blah, 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 blah. Hopefully you saw the talk on Friday all about it. But we were dubbed the SHAC 7. We were essentially tried as domestic terrorists for running a grassroots campaign to shut down Huntington Life Sciences, one of the world's largest animal testing facilities. And we all, as a collective movement, were highly successful in reshaping the vivisection and the financial industries forever. And because of that, we were indicted by the federal government. We went to trial. We were found guilty. I was sentenced to 48 months in federal prison, which I did in 2 prisons in Southern California. And I found myself sitting in this lovely facility in Victorville, California, outside of Los Angeles. I found myself sitting there in a pretty frightening medium security prison, trying to avoid getting beaten up or getting stabbed or avoiding race riots, figuring out how to sneak some tofu into my cell, all the important things. But I also thought a lot about the people that I was surrounded by, including, but not limited to, how do we as a movement that some claim will achieve animal liberation like in our lifetime, like in the next 30, 40 years, like our job will be done, how do we make this entire society that I'm in prison with, how do we get them on board with animal liberation? And a lot of these people were going to be imprisoned in that compound for the next 20 or 30 years. And a lot of them were there because the government and the social programs and society in general had failed them. They were often impoverished. They had little or no access to the education system. They were discarded by society because they had, before they actually had a chance to prove their worth to society. So they turned to drugs, or they turned to gangs, or they turned to both. They found community and solace in others who shared in their day-to-day struggles simply to survive, and not to wind up dead by their 21st birthday, which is a very stark reality in the United States. So I would sit in there and I would talk with these people every single day, and I'd listen to their stories that led them to prison, to their incarceration, of how people were deported out of the United States because they were undocumented, and they had to leave their kids behind in the United States. And they were in prison because they had snuck back across the border one too many times just to spend the day with their kids or sit with their sick and dying parents. Or the people I would help with basic math or general reading skills so they could get their GED, which is like the equivalent of a high school diploma without going to high school. Helping them with their GED because they dropped out of high school, because they were literally fighting to stay alive, and that was more important to them than getting a high school diploma. So there was 1,300 men incarcerated in Victorville Medium Security Prison, and I would bet that they were a pretty accurate cross-section of the American working class and lower class populations. So simply put, they were in prison, all the people in there were everyone else who wasn't hanging out today in the Animal Rights Conference in a slaughterhouse. And the only difference between those people that were inside this prison and the people that were outside of prison was simply the barbed wire that separated the two of us. So the question that stayed in my head throughout the years in prison was like, how do we get these people to care about the rights of animals when they were focusing on just barely surviving? They didn't care about the animal laboratory me and my friends were trying to shut down. They couldn't worry about whether if it was food or whether it was violence. They were just trying to get enough money to feed their family, anything. And they didn't care about confectionary's glaze and the fact that it was in junior mints. But this is, as I said in my opinion, what the majority of the United States looks like demographically. These are folks we need to figure out how to get on board in one way or another with social change, which should include the idea of animal liberation. So movements, as I said, including the animal rights movement, has been the most successful, I would argue, when they captured the imagination of the people and they got them to relate to the issue on a personal level. So I think by discarding purity politics, looking for unlikely allies, and be willing to pour your heart into other movements because you value their importance rather than you getting something immediately in return from those other movements, we can start to begin to build broader liberation struggles. So what does that actually look like? So I'm pretty sure purity politics are prevalent in just about any movement that we could be involved in, but I see it rear its kind of ugly head in the animal rights movement all the time. And we have this enormous task, right, of convincing people to extend the reach of their compassion farther than they ever have even considered, and to maintain that for the rest of their lives by subscribing to the idea of animal liberation. But oftentimes we end up beating them down because they haven't reached that level of our own purity that we have in ourselves. And I'm pretty confident any one of us could switch on our phones, go onto Facebook, and within minutes we could find, this repeated over and over of like, I'm better than you, I have this level of purity that you don't. And I found stuff really quickly. So here's a great example of the hundreds and hundreds of things you can see all the time. If you go to SeaWorld, I hope you choke to death. Yes, I really do. So it's at first glance, maybe you get a chuckle out of it, right? But I see this shit every single day, all day, because unfortunately, I have to sit on social media all day as part of my job, which is awful. But if we really want to run SeaWorld out of business, right, we need to make it completely unprofitable for them to stay open. It's basic capitalism. But how are we going to change hearts and minds and consider people or convince people not to go to these places the way that like Blackfish, the movie, did? If we literally are wishing death on people who simply might not be aware of what's going on at SeaWorld, or someone who might not given the issue some real thought yet. So one of my favorite examples of how purity politics, I think, completely alienates the animal rights movement from other struggles, and thus keeping us from reaching our goals of liberation, is the popular slogan, "You can't be a meat-eating environmentalist." Yes, eating meat obviously is bad for the environment. And yes, I think we should encourage veganism as a step forward to alleviating the destruction of the environment and the climate. But the slogan is such a stark reminder to me that as a vegan, quote, I'm better than you, and if you don't reach my level of superiority, the rest of your politics about the environment or whatever else are worthless. And I see the environmental movement as one of the animal rights' closest potential allies. We're both struggling in fights to save the natural world, and we see a real sense of urgency in it. So our movements have almost always run parallel to one another, right? But they never really seem to constantly overlap or actually just come together as one. But we never seem to fully, get that going. And when it comes to the animal rights movement, I think purity politics is a major reason why. And I think both movements are to blame, but I think from an animal rights perspective, I think our purity politics is part of it. So as a job, I work for the Rainforest Action Network, which is an environmental organization in the United States. We work all over the world. And I've worked there for several years. And people love to attack us and send us these emails because they saw us for 10 seconds in a documentary called Cowspiracy. So Cowspiracy is a great movie, don't get me wrong, right? I'm friends with the people who made it, and I think they did a great job. The movie does an amazing job of showing the connection between meat consumption and climate change, and you should definitely check it out if you haven't. I think Keegan, the filmmaker, you might know him as True Nature. He plays the guitar. I think he's traveling around Europe with the movie and showing it, so definitely go out and check it out. But in it, it talks about how Rainforest Action Network isn't doing anything to help the environment because we don't push animal issues. But what they don't tell you in the movie is that Rainforest Action Network has campaigned against the cattle industry in the Amazon before anyone else was. We cost Burger King $35 million in lost contracts, that all our events are vegetarian and vegan, that we have people on staff who have spent time in South America campaigning against the grazing of cattle. I would go as far to say that Rainforest Action Network has done more than almost any other animal rights organization when it comes to cattle grazing in the Amazon. And we also recently launched a campaign going after industrial animal agriculture and climate change in the US. So for an environmental organization, we're doing actually quite well, in my opinion. But could we do more? Of course we could, right? Everyone could. Yet because not everyone on staff is vegan, because the organization doesn't currently make animal agriculture the #1 campaign priority, we are considered a target by the animal rights movement. We get emails, we get people calling and emailing and writing all the time and saying like, we're destroying the planet, so forth and so on, because we're not promoting veganism, so forth. The list goes on and on. And I can tell you firsthand, by spending years in the large NGO environmental organization world, this isn't doing the animals any favors, right? If anything, it's making that progress harder. And as I said, I'm telling you that from firsthand experience working within these groups. So I think we need to be thinking of ways to be working together rather than alienating such a huge population of activists and resources. So we demand this purity not only of ourselves, but everyone else we would consider aligning with. So what's one of the first things we give people that have just gone vegan? An ingredients list, right? This is the first one that I got. It's a great book. This is, I think, probably within like the first few months of being vegan, I got this book. It was a 92-page book of lists and lists of animal ingredients, lists and lists of things that might be animal ingredients, and you're like at the grocery store flipping through a 92-page book to read, 30 ingredients on some processed shitty food you don't even want to buy. But, this is what we have. And we're told, though, to memorize this, right, and don't mess it up. We instill this sense of fear into people by making the primary goal as not to make a mistake. It's pressure, and I think that pressure starts to take a toll. So we've seen the reports that say people leave veganism because it's too difficult. When they leave veganism, they also leave animal activism. So it shouldn't come as a surprise that when we look around every few years in our movement, that is completely different. I've been doing animal rights activism for 20 years, and like every 5 years, I'm like, where did all my friends go, and who are all these people? But we need to allow people to make mistakes. So we need people to feel okay in being vulnerable, and we need to make space for people to be able to grow. And we shouldn't be naming and shaming people who aren't on the same level of activism or veganism as us. So we have plenty of role models in society, right, and how to be judgmental, but not enough on how to be truly compassionate and understanding. And I think we need to be focusing more on being those type of role models. So there's an author in the United States, his name's Crass. He's the author of a book called Towards Collective Liberation, which you should check out if you have not. And he paraphrases Voltaire when he says that perfection gets in the way of the good. Perfect in utopia is the enemy of progress. It makes you think you have to be perfect before you can move forward. So the longer we wait for perfection, the longer we wait to move forward. When we start to do away with the need for perfection, we can start to see opportunities for unlikely allies and collaboration, opportunities to strengthen our communities, to learn from the mistakes and successes of others, and use collective power to achieve our goals. But that takes patience, I think it takes compassion, and it takes meeting people where they're at politically. So this is when I dive into a little bit of U.S. history. So if this is odd or you don't understand or whatever, just shoot your hand up. But are people familiar with like the Confederate flag in the United States and what that symbolizes, or not so much? Okay, so basically, real quick history lesson, which I'm probably gonna just be completely wrong. But in the 1800s, there's a civil war in the United States between the northern states, the southern states over capitalism, primarily the slavery of African Americans. And they fought each other in a war, and the South, who was kind of defending slavery and plantations, they had a battle flag that was the Confederate flag, which you see on the back of this jacket. They lost, obviously. Slaves were emancipated, so forth and so on. A lot of states and people in the South still fly the Confederate flag as like, this is our history of the South, but really it's like a history of slavery, right? So it's kind of like, it's a symbol of like fucked up period of the United States. And people still are like about it for some reason. But, so if you saw this person on the street and you knew the history of the Confederate flag and what it meant, what would your first thought be, right? Would it be tell them to fuck off, to call them a racist, or would it be to organize with these people? Now imagine this same scenario in the 60s in the United States. So in the 60s in the United States was this incredibly revolutionary period. It was the closest that we had been to armed revolution against the government since the founding of our country in the 1700s. And this was like the 1960s, 1970s, like just on the very brink of armed revolution, if not already starting. So as the modern day fight, and it was around the Vietnam War and it was around racism. Right, so at the modern day fight against white supremacy was reaching like really intense peaks and troughs. You know, how would you then react to something like this, right? Would your feelings be even more intense to political climate, in that political climate? So in Chicago, which is in Illinois in the center of the United States, the Black Panther Party was organizing black folks for self-determination, to live free from the oppression of the state and the racist police force. So this is another like US, European question. Are people familiar with the Black Panther Party? Cool, just really quickly. My personal favorite, and I think the most important social justice movement in the history of the United States. If you want to read about an amazing, amazing organization, read about the Black Panther Party. They were basically black people that were sick of seeing their community being destroyed by racists and by racist police. They started an organization with the idea of self-empowerment, that they should be able to control their own destinies in a state, in a country that had basically kidnapped them and brought them across the ocean. And they wanted self-determination. So they were most known for carrying guns. So in the 60s, you could legally, openly carry weapons. And so the police would drive around Oakland, California, and other places, and every city in the United States, and brutalize black people, just like beat the living hell out of them, and unchecked, right? And so the Black Panther Party decided they would carry guns, they would follow the police in the cars, and when they got out to brutalize people, they would get out with their guns, and they would watch, and the cops would be like, get the fuck out of here, and like, this is our legal right, we're allowed to be here, and we're gonna monitor you, you do your job, but we're gonna monitor you, and they were armed. And then the cops were like, whoa, okay. And so then the police brutality really dropped. But also what they did is they set up breakfast programs where they were feeding more poor children before school in the morning than the United States government was. They set up medical clinics that were inoculating poor people in the United States against diseases, more people than the United States government was. So they became a real threat to the US government. So Chicago, Black Panther Party, 1960s. It was led in Chicago by a man named Fred Hampton, and it was one of the most intense battles in all of the country for the Black Panther Party. Communities of color were being killed off and beaten down by the police like on a regular basis. And one of the tactics the police would use to neutralize and divide poor communities was they would take like a black person from a black community and like arrest them, and then they drive them across the city to like a poor white community, drop them off there and leave them with no resources to get back. And then they would do the same thing. They'd pick up a white person, a poor white person, drop them in a poor black community with no way to get back. And the idea was that they wanted to stir up trouble and instigate these race wars. That these divisions would keep the poor communities fighting each other instead of fighting back against the power structures, right? Against white supremacy. So at the same time as the Panthers, the Black Panther Party in Chicago grew, another group also started organizing in the same way. So Chicago also had, as I said, a large population of poor white people who had migrated from the South for work. And they too were being beaten up by the police and the government. And they formed a group called the Young Patriots. And I was really lucky. This guy, one of the main organizers, his name's Hy Thurman. He hadn't spoken since the 70s because he had been so much PTSD from his activism that he was scared. And so, like last year, he finally decided, like, I want to talk about the Young Patriots. Real honor to be able to talk with him. But he talked about how they looked towards the Black Panther Party as an inspiration and saw what they were doing in their communities and tried to replicate that in their own neighborhoods to raise up their own, poor working class families. And to fight back. And they saw how the Panthers were wearing like the leather jackets and the berets, and they were carrying the guns. And that vision scared a lot of people. But it was also something that their communities could relate to, and it allowed them to meet each other at their level and to open doors and open communications. So the Young Patriots, they wore Confederate flags on the back of their jackets. And Hy Thurman said, in retrospect, that probably was not a good idea. But it gave the community that they were in something that felt familiar to them from their home, their area in the country in the South. It gave something familiar to them that they could kind of latch to, whether they supported it or not. It was like an image of their home, right? So it let the Young Patriots meet their community where they currently were at their political level instead of insisting that they rise to their political level. So Fred Hampton, the organizer in Chicago, he saw the Young Patriots. He saw what they were about. He recognized what they were doing with the Confederate flag in order to talk to their own people. And when most people saw them as problems, he saw them as allies. So he reached out to them, right? And they started a program where when that white person was dropped off in the black community, the Panthers would meet them and escort them back safely back to their communities, and vice versa. The Young Patriots would pick up the poor black person that was stuck in the community and had no way to get home, and they would transfer them back. So it reduced the tension in the communities. It slowed down like the us versus them feel that the police were trying to create, and eventually led to what was called the Rainbow Coalition. So the Rainbow Coalition was this really amazing, powerful coalition between Black Panther Party members, the Young Patriots, and the Young Lords, which is like a Puerto Rican-based radical organization. And they began organizing together. They began unifying the black people and the white people and the brown people and all their communities in Chicago in a way that had never been done before. They brokered truces between all the rival gangs in Chicago that were killing one another and got them on board with political education and fighting for their people instead of against them. And then they started winning. So they can say that you can tell the level of your effectiveness with your activism by the way that your opponent reacts. And the local and national law enforcement agencies were furious at what was going on in Chicago. And they realized what was happening, and they decided they needed to end it before it became too successful. So they really ramped up the repression in the United States. It was called COINTELPRO, which stands for Counterintelligence Program, which is, as far as the United States goes, some of the worst repression that's been hit against political activists, where they were literally the government was literally killing activists to stop them. But the idea was to disrupt, isolate, and neutralize social justice movements. So it got to the point where they knew that Fred Hampton was on track to be a national leader in the Black Panther Power, or the Black Power movement, and he had the ability to bring all of these different communities together from all different backgrounds. So he was a major threat to these power structures. So on December 4th, the local authorities, as well as the FBI, they raided Fred Hampton's apartment at 4 o'clock in the morning. They shot up his bedroom that he was sleeping in with his wife, who was pregnant with her 8-month. She had been pregnant for 8 months. They shot it up, and when they found Fred Hampton was still alive, witnesses say that the two cops dragged him out of his bed and shot him point blank in the head and said that he's good and dead. So they killed him because they were so terrified at his ability to organize people and communities, to stop gang violence, and to have them become a unified force against the war on the poor. He started the Rainbow Coalition to bring different communities together, not because they each had the exact politics as one another, but because deep down inside they all wanted the same general idea. They all wanted the same general principle, which was liberation. And the US government was so afraid of different struggles working together that they considered this the biggest threat to the security of the nation, to the point where they started murdering people. So what is a more current example of unlikely allies forming for the greater good? So in California, in the state prison system, so every state in the United States has their own prison system, and then there's a federal prison system. But the state prison system in California is really terrible. It's called the California Departments of Corrections. And they incarcerate and imprison tens of thousands of people in solitary confinement, right? So it's called the shoe or the hole. And it's designed to break you. So when I was incarcerated, I was lucky. I was only in the hole in solitary for 8 days, which in the grand scheme of things is really nothing. But it's a terrible place. This is a solitary confinement cell in California State Prison. There's no windows. There's I don't need to describe it to you, right? This is awful, right? And people have to live in there 22, 24 hours a day. And they will live like that. And they only get out for maybe a shower. And if they're lucky, they go out to recreation where like you're in a little dog run and you can run around in circles and then for an hour and then they bring you back and put you in here, right? And the California Department of Corrections, the prison system in California, they keep people in there for decades, literally decade after decade. And they're placed there mostly for allegedly being a member of a gang, which is incredibly easy to be classified as a gang member. You can be, I had a friend of mine, not in gangs, but he went to a funeral of his friend who was in a gang. And on Facebook, there was a picture of him and 30 of the other guy's friends all standing around the coffin. They took a picture and put it on Facebook. And then the cops went and said, all these people are in a gang. And they took my friend Rollo. Now they put they call him a gang injunction, right? They put him as a known gang member, which means now in his own neighborhood, he can't talk on a cell phone. He can't wave at his friends across the street. He can't cross the street to go talk to a friend. And he can't be in a group of more than 3 people. Otherwise, he's engaged in gang activity. And this is how the U.S. government controls, right? Continues to control poor people in these neighborhoods. But that's how easy it is to be classified as a gang member in the United States. So now when he or anyone like that goes to prison, they're automatically put into solitary confinement. And the only way you can get out is if you do what they call debriefing. And debriefing means you have to inform on yourself. You have to tell the police everything you've ever done illegal. You have to tell everything that you know that your friends have done illegal. You have to have your gang tattoos removed with a laser. And then the government decides, well, maybe that wasn't good enough, and they throw you back in the SHU or solitary, or they can let you out, right? Totally arbitrary, up to them. So in the past few years, people in California state prisons have been fighting back against this. They've had enough of it. They started organizing and asking for solidarity from people on the outside with letter writings and protests and call-ins and pen pal programs so that inmates knew they were supported. They had hundreds of people on hunger strike demanding that they get treated like humans, and it didn't really do a whole lot. But in the summer of 2013, an unlikely coalition of people put this plan into action. Because the SHU tries not only to segregate people from their communities, but they also try to segregate them from their gangs. So they take all the leaders that they deem leaders of these gangs, and they put them in this special wing where it's just like 4 or 5 people they think are the leaders, so that they can't talk to anyone else and give anyone like directions on how to run the gangs. So, but what they did, they thought, they put them all in this area, but they won't talk to one another because they hate each other. They literally kill each other on sight, right? So they thought, we'll put them in this special place, we'll isolate them so they can't communicate with anyone, but we'll leave them there until they die, and that'll be the end of that. But they started talking to one another. So a couple of these gang leaders began reading books about revolution and revolutionary theory, and then they started discussing it with one another by yelling at each other across the hallway in their cells. They basically started like a radical book club, right, in prison. But it got them thinking about things. And they came to the realization over years that these racial divides among them, between all the gangs, weren't real, that they were just social constructs that were built by the prison system to keep them controlled, right? So if all the prison inmates are fighting one another, they're not fighting back against the prison. So the prison likes that. So the head of the 4 biggest and deadliest gangs in the United States, who normally, as I said, would kill each other on sight, started a book club, which got them organizing with each other, right? So you think it's hard to get 100 people to RSVP to your Facebook event or to come to your protest, right, your animal rights protest? They spent years organizing by passing notes under doors secretly and yelling through drain pipes and getting the word out to other parts of the prison, which then spread to other prisons around the country, or around California, that we should all unite against solitary confinement. So they had a day in mind, and when that day came, 30,000 people in the institutions all over California, or the prisons in California, all refused their meal at the same time. 30,000 people, right? Imagine the power and the unity that was displayed. People who literally kill one another in prison over territory, drugs, money, respect, they suddenly came together and said enough was enough, that they were able to organize people all over the state, inside and outside a prison, from within a prison, inside a prison, right? Think about that for a second, too. So they looked towards really unlikely allies to overcome a common enemy. So let me reiterate from the beginning of my talk. Like, I'm not advocating we all go out and form alliances with the heads of notorious prison gangs and, like, nationalists, right? But I think unlikely allies in this situation is an understatement. So let that sink in for a minute, that the head of the Aryan Brotherhood works with the Black Guerrilla Family, which is a black nationalist gang, the Mexican Mafia, and the Nuestra Familia, arguably the four biggest and deadliest gangs in the United States, collectively recognized that they were a prison class and that the racial divides were orchestrated by the prison system to keep them divided, and they were all going to work together to end it. Amazing. Some of them spent almost 60 days on hunger strike before calling it off, and the prison system promised to go into meetings and about reform around solitary confinement, and after months of negotiations, literally like last week, the inmates won, and the California prison system has announced that they are going to phase out the indefinite solitary confinement. Unbelievable. Yeah. So I say this pretty regularly, but I cannot stress enough the importance of reaching out to previous generations to talk about activism and theory and strategy, not just within the animal rights movement, but finding other movements to really get into and learn from their mistakes and their successes. Because when I got out of prison, I was feeling really lost and I was feeling really down. This is another US thing, but like it was a former Weather Underground activist. Are people familiar with the Weather Underground? They were like a white underground direct action movement that was fighting against the corporations, the government, and the war. And they were like doing just crazy, crazy shit, from organizing these giant protests to like literally bombing federal buildings. I ended up spending time with one of a Weather Underground member who had been arrested and gone to prison and got out. And that time with him, he met with me and he listened and he shared his own experiences, and that was really helpful. And when I was feeling unsure about my own activism when I got out of prison, I didn't know what to do or how I could play a part, or how just feeling really kind of down about things. It was revolutionaries from the 70s. They were more than willing to share like a kind word with me or a story, or maybe go out to dinner and talk things through. And I got a glimpse of what it looks like to truly pour your heart into a movement that isn't yours, because you know that it's just the right thing to do. So we hear people in the animal rights movement and other movements, throw around the word intersectional a lot. And I've heard animal rights activists describe themselves as intersectional because, for instance, they fight for the liberation of animals, and that would bring about a better world, which would include the liberation of Palestine. So they actually are fighting for the liberation of Palestine by fighting for animal rights. But they do absolutely nothing actually to directly support Palestinian people. So now, I don't doubt their intentions and that they feel passionate about it. But I'm certainly not an expert on intersectionality, but that doesn't seem to fit the definition for me. But like I said, I'm far from having a clear understanding on what it looks like in practice, but I'm learning. But when I think about collective liberation or intersectionality and what that actually looks like, I look at the 70s and 80s as a time when activists in the United States, they threw themselves deep into movements that had no personal outcomes for themselves, right? But because they believed in the liberation of others. They were working really heavily in other movements outside of their own because they felt like that was the right thing to do. So I spent a lot of time with people like Claude Marks on the left and Donna Jean Wilma on the right. They were the first people in the FBI that they labeled as like a team on the most wanted list. And they were on the most wanted list for allegedly plotting to use a helicopter and bombs to liberate Oscar Lopez Rivera from prison. He's like a head of the Puerto Rican independence movement. And they're both white people, right? They're not Puerto Rican, but they recognize the importance of the Puerto Rican independence movement and how important it was to support them as white people. And they would eventually be caught and they would do time in prison. They sacrificed years and years of their lives for the liberation of others that had little to no direct impact on their lives, on their personal lives whatsoever. And I found that incredibly inspiring. And then there's Marilyn Buck. I'm not even going to ask if anyone knows who Marilyn Buck is because I'm assuming no one knows who Marilyn Buck is. Anyone? How about Assata Shakur? Do people know who Assata Shakur is? Cool. A couple of people. So Assata Shakur, she is like, how you can go anywhere in the world and you can see pictures of like Che Guevara as like this radical, revolutionary like anywhere. So Assata Shakur is like that in the US. Like she is like the picture of revolution in the United States. She was a member of the Black Panther Party and the Black Liberation Army. She was accused of several crimes between 1971 and 1973. including the alleged killing of a state trooper from New Jersey in a shootout. She was captured. She was eventually sentenced to prison. And then she escaped from prison, and she went to Cuba. So Cuba-United States relations, not so good. Cuba will not allow people to be extradited to the United States. So she lives in Cuba as a political exile. So everyone in the United States knows who Assata Shakur is. They know her story. She's the face of revolution. But no one knows who Marilyn Buck is. So Marilyn Buck, who is pictured here with Kwame Ture, otherwise known as Stokely Carmichael, my personal favorite social justice activist of all time. I'm getting off on a tangent, but if you ever want to read an amazing book, his autobiography is unbelievable, and it blows my mind that he went to go visit Marilyn Buck in prison, and it makes me a little jealous. So Marilyn Buck was a white woman from Texas whose parents were involved in the civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s. When she went to college, she became radicalized around the Vietnam War and the anti-racist organizing going on in the United States. She would later be convicted of her roles in robbing armored cars. They would rob armored cars and banks to fund other movements. So they would take that money and give it to like the Black Liberation Army. She was convicted of bombing the US Senate, and she was also found of guilty of participating in liberating Assata Shakur from prison. So she was, apparently the one responsible for getting Assata Shakur out of prison. So for that action, Marilyn Buck would be sentenced to 80 years in prison, right? That was a life sentence. She got cancer when she was in prison. She was granted a compassionate release, so they let her out basically so they don't have to pay the medical bills while she dies. So in 2010, she was released. She died less than a month later. So I had the privilege of going to her memorial that was in Oakland, California, and I sat in the last row of the top balcony in this church. And before me were like over 1,000 activists and radicals and revolutionaries from all over. And my head was exploding because these were all the people I had read about and admired when I was young, and that had really inspired me. And here they all were. And it was this really amazing and touching salute to Marilyn Buck, this really true revolutionary who really embraced the idea of intersectionality and working with other movements outside of her own. But near the end, they had this recording that they wanted to play that they said found their way out of Cuba. And they played this recording, an audio recording of Assata Shakur, saying her final farewell to Marilyn Buck. And this still chokes me up because it's so powerful. But without going into too much detail, she basically was thanking Marilyn Buck, right, for all that she had done for her. And it got me thinking about what it truly means to sacrifice yourself for the greater good, for struggles that aren't immediately your own. Not because you want something in return, or you want the recognition, or because you want them to come to your animal rights demonstration, but doing it because we all want to be free, and we're all willing to support each other in each other's struggles. So I don't know if we still do this, but in our more embarrassing days in the United States in the 90s, when we would chant, "What do we want? Animal liberation," we would unfortunately also add, "Are we going to get it? Yes." And then we'd say, "Are we willing to die for it? Yeah." And we're all in our camos and hooded sweatshirts, and everyone would cheer, and we felt really powerful, and it was really embarrassing. But we see a lot of that rhetoric in the animal rights movement, right? I would trade my life to save the life of this dog or a chicken or whatever animal. And it feels good to say that, and I've probably said that myself, right? But what does that really mean? Have we really thought about what that looks like, to trade your life for another? Marilyn Buck literally traded her life, spending decades and decades, and eventually dying, basically behind bars, to save the life of one other person. She traded her freedom so that Assata Shakur could have hers. She didn't boast about it. She didn't post it on Facebook. She didn't yell about it in chants. She didn't do it in order to benefit herself. She just did it because she felt it was the right thing to do, regardless of the outcome, because we all want to be and deserve to be free. She recognized her privilege as a white person and recognized that in the United States as a black person you have so fewer privileges, and that she wanted to do something about that to the point where she would literally trade her freedom for another. So we as an animal rights movement, we have so much talent, we have so much potential to bring about social change. And I would argue we already have shifted things in these really massive ways. But I think we have so much more potential if we start positioning ourselves as part of a broader and bigger liberation struggle, rather than place ourselves as a moral superior. So I find our movement, unfortunately, sounding more and more like the religious right. So I'm sure you have this in Europe, but in the United States, we have like the religious right, like the fanatical religious people, the pro-life activists, that are bombing abortion clinics and killing doctors. And I find that the animal rights movement starts to sound more and more like that religious right. As animal rights activists, we often say we are the voice for the voiceless, right? We speak for those who can't speak for themselves. But that sounds all too familiar, right? So is this what we want to portray as an animal rights movement? It says that we know what's best for everyone, that it's our way or the highway. You agree with us or you're out, that we are morally superior. So a few months ago, a 20-year-old white upper-class cis man who is a leader of one of the biggest grassroots animal rights groups in the United States right now wrote, "To be clear, I, and Direct Action Everywhere, believe nothing short of a vegan diet is morally permissible." So think about how that sounds. Think about that when we go to other movements and try to partner with them, right? How are we going to be taken seriously as a liberation movement if we have 20-year-old upper-class white men telling people of color, telling working class and lower class people, indigenous people, queer and trans people, that they are morally inferior because of what they are currently eating? The same food that 20-year-old was eating a couple years ago. So as I said, I think the animal rights movement has so much to offer. It fights for compassion in massive ways. It has resources and unbelievable talent. It has dedication, it has passion. It has interesting strategies and amazing tactics. It has selflessness, and it has loads of victories. But I think we can be so much more if we share with and support those in other liberation struggles. If we fight side by side with them, rather than trying to lift them up to our level, to our moral baseline, to what we deem as morally permissible. If we recognize our quest for purity is what is really holding us back. If we recognize that liberation means so much more than to so many people beyond just the idea of animal liberation. Because we all want to be free, right? We all want to be free. Animals, both human and non-human. And the sooner we can start acting and organizing like that, I think the sooner it can also become a reality. So thank you.